So, in order to properly prepare you for this letter to Bernhard Lang, I wanted to prepare a few ideas for you so that you would understand in general terms what I'm talking about. I am not going to try to make you a Kantian philosopher today. And so, we're just to give you some background on Immanuel Kant, though, and we're talking mainly here about ethics, and you'll see in a few moments why Kantian ethics is significant. But Kantian ethics revolve entirely around duty rather than emotions or end goals. Kant regarded himself as showing the way beyond the impasse which modern philosophy had led to between rationalists and empiricists. That's Kantianism, and you can find it on Wikipedia. There's a much more complex discussion, but one of his ideas was categorical imperative, grounding for the metaphysics of morals. And so the first formulation of this is objective. And the rule basically is act as if the maxims of your action were to become, through your will, a universal law of nature. So you're going to create a law that will be a universal law of nature. It will be applied to everybody and everything in the world. Okay, the second formulation is subjective, and so it's act in such a way that you treat humanity, whether in your own person or any other, never merely as a means to an end, but always at the same time as an end. A slave owner would be asserting a property right in another person and treating them as a means to an end. So that would not be moral according to Immanuel Kant. And then the third formulation is, it is not enough that the right conduct be followed, but that one also demands that conduct of oneself. That is, a moral person, though with freedom to choose, will always choose the same result for himself as for everyone else. And so some people say this is like the golden rule, but it is not like the golden rule in the sense that it is not formal. The golden rule is not formal and not necessarily binding, but in Kantian perspective, it is binding. It's a universal law of nature. Now, obviously, that brings up conflicts of duties. For example, do you tell a murderer where his prey is if you know? Okay, so the strict Kantian rule would be yes, you do, because you never lie. But the other duty would be to just not say, and that's a conflict of duties. And a conflict of duties does come up relatively frequently in Dr. Jung's oeuvre, so it's something worth noting. Now, obviously, these issues play out in politics, as is clearly demonstrated by the USA's red state, blue state neurosis. Okay, so Doctors Jung and Edinger were medical doctors. They were psychiatrists. They were both psychiatrists, and they were always looking for the best medical outcome for their patients, be they individuals, groups, societies, or the whole human race. And they regarded themselves as the chosen vessels to synthesize the dichotomy between science and religion, viewing religious texts as empirical psychic facts. Now, I'm going to have Dr. Edinger explain that to you in a moment. But in answer to Job, which we're talking about on Thursday at 1:30, Dr. Jung said in paragraph 752, "It does not matter at all that a physically impossible fact is asserted, because all religious assertions," I say again, all religious assertions are physical impossibilities. If they were not so, they would, as I said earlier, necessarily be treated in the textbooks of natural science. But religious statements, without exception, have to do with the reality of the psyche and not with the reality of the physis, that is, of the physical world. And so we have to remember that Dr. Jung considered himself a scientist, but not one who could use the traditional scientific method, which holds many variables constant and solves for X, for example. That's a simplistic way of talking about the scientific method. I do understand it's more complicated, but in order to understand a psychic fact, which he did empirically in his consulting room, you have to understand the whole person. You cannot hold variables constant, because when you look at something in the psyche, it changes, similar to the way light is perceived, sometimes as a wave and sometimes as a particle, depending on your method of observation. So now what I want to do, and I'll look at your chat comments while I'm showing this little video, but I want to show what did I do here? I want to show you just a little portion of this interview with Dr. Edinger, because he covers Dr. Jung and what he was and what he considered himself to be. And so that's pretty important for what we're talking about. And it's also important for this letter that I want to read, which is Bernhard Lang letter. So I'm going to play just 6 minutes of this, and then I'll come back. And here it is. Whoops. Are we hearing it? That's a question. I guess. Okay, because I was a little bit uncertain there when I was starting that. And again, this is a behind the scenes thing, so there's no warranties here. You're here watching me make all my mistakes without without any intermediary or editing of any kind. So now I'm going to restart the video where I wanted it. And so this is Edward Edinger talking about Dr. Jung as a scientist.
I consider Jung's work primarily, and I think he did too, primarily to be a scientific accomplishment. What he did was to discover through his own personal experience, both individually and with patients, he discovered the objective psyche, the psyche as an objective entity, as contrasted to just a subjective entity. And that led him into a region of such immense dimensions that he then spent the rest of his life trying to describe and present some of the major aspects of the nature of the objective psyche as he'd discovered it. So he is primarily, fundamentally, a scientific genius who has made a totally new discovery, a totally new dimension of being has been laid bare, and following that discovery, he was obliged to create a whole new methodology of approaching it, because since it's a new object, it cannot be approached by the old methodology that physical science used. Physical science requires a methodology different from science of depth psychology, because
So I spent a lot of
nature of the
time,
subject
I'm a
matter is
scientist,
different.
but I would say I'm also a religious person. I'm a deeply
psyche
religious person.
requires
And
a
how do you
methodology
reconcile
that
those?
engages
Exactly. Well, that, and I've spent 40
whole
years thinking
person.
about that. And for 20
Physical
of those
science
years,
by its
I did
nature
almost nothing but think about
excludes
that
a
all the
significant
time.
portion of the whole person, you see, as irrelevant.
Okay, I made a mistake. I was trying to prepare.
But
I was trying to prepare something for you in the back, and I was working on a short video that Jordan Peterson did on the distinction between science and religion, and I didn't realize that I was going to end up giving you that too. So it was over talking Dr. Edinger. I'm going to resume Dr. Edinger. I'm going to go back 1 minute in what he was saying and play it again. I'm sorry for the inconvenience, but as I said, this is behind the scenes. You're getting it raw.
that discovery, he was obliged to create a whole new methodology of approaching it, because since it's a new object, it cannot be approached by the old methodology that physical science used. Physical science requires a methodology different from science of depth psychology, because the nature of the subject matter is different. The psyche requires a methodology that engages the whole person. Physical science, by its nature, excludes a significant portion of the whole person, you see, as irrelevant. But dealing with the psyche requires an engagement of the whole person. And that's a totally new approach, and people have yet to learn it. Jung teaches us how to do it, but we still have to learn it. Anyway, he was obliged to create that whole new methodology in order to deal with the new subject that he discovered, the subject of the objective psyche, and this is what he's done in all his mature work. So that's how I think of him fundamentally. However, what he discovered when he discovered the objective psyche and started exploring it was that it is the source of religion, of philosophy, of art, of mythology, of worldviews of all kinds. It's the source of those. Therefore, although we say quite accurately, no, Jungian psychology is not a religion. It's not a philosophy. It's not a Weltanschauung. Nonetheless, it deals with the source of all of those, and it has also discovered in the course of realizing the practical aspect of encounter with the psyche, which is psychotherapy. It's discovered that psychotherapy, if it's going to be complete in the individual case, involves the individual's discovery of a religious standpoint and of a Weltanschauung. So that Jungian psychology, when it's applied, does lead to religious consciousness and to the emerging awareness of a new worldview, even though Jungian psychology itself is not a religion or a worldview. It's as though it's more fundamental than that. Just because Jung talks about religious imagery and religious phenomenology, many people superficially think he's a religionist, or as you said earlier, he's a mystic. That's not true. He's an empirical scientist of the psyche. That's what he is.
So I spent a lot of time, I'm a scientist, but I would say I'm also a religious person. I'm a deeply religious person. And
how do you reconcile those?
Yeah. Exactly. Well, that's that. And I've spent 40 years thinking about that. And for 20 of those years, I did almost nothing but think about that all the time. And I realized something, partly from reading Carl Jung. And what I realized was that even the fundamentalists have.
Okay, as you see, I'm fumbling around with the backstage technology, and I apologize for that. I'm going to start that video over in a moment. Not the Edinger video, but I realized that I had my microphone turned off, so you were getting gobbledygook there. I'm sorry for that. Anyway, I also found a very useful section of an interview with Dr. Jordan Peterson, which would give you a 21st century perspective on this. And so I wanted to play that also, and obviously I'm going to have a lot of editing to do on this video. But anyway, it seems useful for you to have a 21st century view, and since Jordan Peterson's ideas are pretty popular right now, I wanted to give you a short piece on his ideas. So that's going to come at you for 5 minutes, and then we'll go on with the letter to Bernhard Lang. And
So I spent a lot of time, I'm a scientist, but I'm also, I would say, I'm also a religious person. I'm a deeply religious person. And
how do you reconcile those?
Yeah. Exactly. Well, that's that. And I've spent 40 years thinking about that. And for 20 of those years, I did almost nothing but think about that all the time. And I realized something, partly from reading Carl Jung. And what I realized was that even the fundamentalists have the wrong idea about religious truth. Religious truth is not scientific truth, like the stories in Genesis, which are very old stories, maybe tens of thousands of years old. They're obviously not scientific theories because the people who wrote them weren't scientists. We didn't have science until about 500 years ago. So the idea that the stories in Genesis are scientific theories is it's just false on every possible front. And so then you might say, well, there's no other truth but scientific truth. It's like, well, wait a minute. That's not true. Because what scientific truth tells you is what things are. But genuine religious truth tells you how you should act. And those things are not the same. And so a great story, like a great novel, which is a quasi-religious construction because it's like a distillation of ordinary life into its most important elements, that's a map about how you should comport yourself in the world. And you might say, well, what do you mean by should? And because that's the question the moral relativists ask. And there's an answer to that too, as far as I can tell. And I got this partly from reading Jean Piaget. So imagine that here's how you should act. You should act so that things are good for you like they would be for someone you're taking care of. But they have to be good for you in a way that's also good for your family. And they have to be good for you and your family in a way that's also good for society. And maybe even also good for the broader environment if you can manage that. So it's balanced at all those levels. And then that has to be good for you and your family and society and the world right now and next week and next month and a year from now and 10 years from now. And so it's this harmonious balancing of multiple layers of being simultaneously. And that's a Darwinian reality, I would say. Your brain is actually attuned to tell you when you're doing that. And the way it tells you is that it reveals that what you're doing is meaningful. That's the sign that your nervous system is adapted to do this. It's adapted to exist, I would say, on the edge between order and chaos. And chaos is where things are so complex you can't handle it, and order is where things are so rigid that it's too restrictive. In between that, there's a place that's meaningful, where you're partly stabilized and partly curious, and you're operating in a manner that increases your scope of knowledge. So you're inquiring and growing, and at the same time you're stabilizing and renewing you, your family, society, nature, now, next week, next month, and next year. And when you have an intimation of meaning, then you know you're there. And I can give you an existential demonstration of that. So imagine that each of these levels of existence, the way I just laid them out, are like patterns. They're patterns within patterns within patterns within patterns. And there's a way of making all that harmonious. That's what music models. That's why music is so meaningful. You know, you take a beautiful orchestral composition and all the instruments are doing different things at different levels, but they all flow together harmoniously. And you're right in the middle of that as a listener. And it fills you with a sense of, it's almost like a sense of religious awe, even if you're a punk rock nihilist, you know. And the reason for that is because the music is modeling the manner of being that's harmonious. It's the proper way to exist. And religious writings in the deepest sense, so those are archetypal writings, are guidelines to that mode of being. So they're not true like scientific truth is true. I think of them as they're hyper true or meta true. It's like we take the most true things about your life, and then we take the most true things about 10 other people's lives, and we amalgamate them into a single figure, and that would be like a literary hero. And then we take 1,000 literary heroes and we extract out from each of them what makes the most heroic person. That's a religious deity. That's extract out from each of them what makes the most heroic person. That's a religious deity. That's what Christ is. He's a meta hero. And that sits at the bottom of Western civilization. And his archetypal mode of being is true speech. That's the fundamental idea of Western civilization. And it's right. So I spent a lot.
Okay, again, I apologize for the gremlins. I'm going to get this off the screen for you here momentarily. I have to. I'm a one-man band here, so I have to do things one at a time. Anyway, all right. So my purpose in pointing to Edinger's book. All right. So we're again pointing to this book, The New God Image, which I'm also showing to my Periscope audience. My purpose is to show what Dr. Jung was saying to us about religion and science and how they come together. And how they come together is a alchemical idea, actually. They come together in the human being, and we are the vessel for that. We're the vessel for that alchemical amalgamation. And so let's see, I wanted to. All right, so at the beginning of the chat, I had given you the definitions, but let me read them here too, because these are words that you need to understand Dr. Jung's letter to Mr. Lang. And so one of them is subjective, and subjective means based on or influenced by personal feelings, tastes, or opinions existing in the mind, coming from the mind. And then objective, a person or judgment not influenced by personal feelings or opinions in considering and representing facts. Factual, real, empirical. And so Dr. Jung's big point in paragraph 751 of Answer to Job is that he regards the psyche as real. And what he's working with in his science, as explained by Dr. Edinger earlier, is psychic facts, facts which he perceived either in his own experiments on himself, which were the Red Book period, or psychic facts which came up in his consulting room over his 60 years of being a psychiatrist. And so those are objective so as Dr. Edinger says, those are objective, those come from the objective psyche. And Dr. Jung was observing those and making scientific conclusions about them. And they were using the Bible and other religious texts as raw material for understanding the ancients from a psychological point of view, what was going on for the ancients. So another word that you need is beati possidentis, which is a Latin word. I don't always read these very well, but the phrase that comes up in this letter is beati possidentis of belief, or the happy owning of belief. And the significance of this is that this letter is about the controversy between Martin Buber and Carl Jung, which went on for some years, as I understand it. But you'll hear what Dr. Jung says about this in this letter to Bernhard Lang. And finally, the word pistis, P-I-S-T-E-S, is a trust or loyalty, faith, and confidence in a certain experience of a numinous nature. As example is the conversion of Paul is a striking example of this, and that comes up in 1 Corinthians 12:9. And so, anyway, so that's the preliminary for the reading of the article or the letter to Bernhard Lang. As I said earlier, as I said earlier, I'm reading from The New God Image by Dr. Edward Edinger, and there are 14 letters in the appendix of this book. And Dr. Edinger used the book as a way to explain what Dr. Jung was saying, and he provided all the letters. And the reason that I had the insight that the Jungian community was hiding the religious aspects of Dr. Jung's work was that I realized that 7 of the letters that appear in this book do not appear in this book, which is C.G. They do not appear in this book, C.G. Jung Letters, and I'm reading from Volume 2 of C.G. Jung Letters, where this particular letter does appear to Bernhard Lang, but 7 of the letters do not appear in the collected letters, and instead they appear in Volume 18 of the collected work. So you have to be pretty committed to study Jung before you're ever going to get to them. And so one of the things that's happening to me is that I'm feeling called to bring Dr. Jung's study of religion up to the surface, because I think that we are killing a lot of people globally in the name of religion. Obviously, politicians are using religion in various ways that are detrimental to the health of a lot of people. And so in the context of morality, modern morality, I want to bring these things up so that you can understand them and so that others around the world can understand them, in the hope that some of us may make a difference out there in the world. Now, before I start reading the letter, I will take a look at the chat feed here and see if there's anything else I should be speaking about. So, let's see, going back. So Julie is telling me what's going on with my feed here, but Grace says, because the unknown questions continue to show themselves, but it is the principles presented that allow you to act out the new God image. That's absolutely right, but you have to first understand what the God image is before you can even think about that. So Miles says, Planet Earth says, we are the crucible. Absolutely. That's the alchemical idea, that we are the vessels, and if we put these ideas in ourselves, then they can spin round and round in our psyches, and new things will come out. And that's basically my whole thought with respect to this channel in its entirety, which is that if people around the world have access to this information, it may change things subtly. And of course, that's what Dr. Edinger was talking about. If you go back and look at the entire interview that Dr. Edinger gave in 1994, you can see that quite clearly. And I've been talking about it for a couple weeks now, so you probably have seen that already. Miles says, every time J.B.P. Peterson says the West or Western civilization, he really means Christ or love, but he doesn't want in order not to lose people. I think these issues are more complicated than that, Miles. I mean, I think that's a simple way of thinking about it. But, you know, you lose people if you say Christ also, and Jesus Christ. I mean, I published a video the other day called Christ as My Brother or something like that, and I published it for Easter as a means of reconciliation between me and my rabbi friend, and explained, I tried to show him through the vehicle of that video that his use of the term the chosen for the Jewish people rankles me about the same as the term Jesus Christ rankles Jews. And so I understood that parallelism. But he's been a practicing rabbi for over 40 years, and he just could not come off his rabbinical way of thinking about it. And so he chose to be offended by my video, which was entirely sincerely intended, as many of you saw, because you saw the reading last week, the behind-the-scenes reading, in which I got quite emotional about that passage. And I left some of the emotionality in the passage, and I was seeing this as a way to reconcile myself and the rabbi, but it didn't really work, unfortunately. So anyway, so I guess the point I'm making to you, Miles, is that these things are extremely complex, and we may get a thought that we can say something and it'll cause offense, or it won't, and you know it does. And so all we can do is put these things in the vessel ourselves and try to come out with it as best we can. We make mistakes, and that video was about that, and the experience was about that as well. So Julie Westmacott says, do you think we need to connect to the self through dreams as opposed to forcing a dogmatic religion on or conscious self? Well, we certainly, one way to connect with the self is through dreams, and the self is attempting to communicate with your conscious mind, and it's necessary for us as 21st century egos to then evaluate. And one of the letters in this is about, one of the letters in Dr. Edinger's book is about the two streams of consciousness. And this was mentioned very early in Christianity, but one is the shadow side, the dark side, which can be evil, but it's also from whence we get our psychic energy. And one is the quote-unquote good side. And what Dr. Jung was constantly saying, and saying in this particular letter, and Dr. Edinger was emphasizing, I was going to read that today, but then I realized I wouldn't get to it, so I'm going to be doing that in the next few days. But one of the points that they make is that the flow of information that's coming from yourself is both good and bad. It's both positive aspects of life, and it is the shadow as well. And so we always have to be evaluating as our egos what is appropriate for our society. And this is why Kant's ideas about categorical imperatives and that sort of thing, and the golden rule, those sorts of things are very important, because in the end, these things come down to us. And what Dr. Jung was talking about in the continuing imperative is, what Dr. Jung was talking about in the continuing incarnation is that we can't just slough off issues of morality to our church and only pay real attention to it on Sundays for an hour if we go to church, or if we go to a meditation group, or if we go to synagogue, or whatever it is, that we are making godlike decisions, each and every one of us. And that's what individuation is about, is understanding that fact and trying to make decisions which are, as Dr. Peterson was talking about, good for us, good for our family, good for our community, good for our nation, and good for humanity at large, now, next week, next year, 10 years from now, 100 years from now, or 2,000 years from now, as is the case with Jesus Christ. That's the way we have to balance our lives in that alchemical way, with us as the vessel, and therefore we have to make these godlike decisions every day. And if we see ourselves in that way, that changes things. I mean, remember the conflict of duties of, suppose you have a murderer in your house, and he's looking for a person that he intends to murder, and do you tell that murderer where that person is if you know? And of course you're making a godlike decision about whether it's right or wrong to lie to the murderer, to not tell him, not lie, but not tell him, that sort of thing. Those are very serious questions. But I mean, these questions come up every day. I mean, I used to see them in kindergarten. I mean, I remember in kindergarten, I happened to have been in Alaska at the time, and there was one fellow in my class that was always lying to me. And it was really amazing. This is still numinous to me as I think about it today. And that was that every time he lied, I perceived his face to light up in a certain way. I guess in a sense I could see his aura or something like that. I mean, auras is a whole different topic. I'm not going to get into it, but it was like that. It was like I could see a light around him. And I think, if I think of it now in terms of empirically what I was seeing, maybe it was a certain emotion that he was not sharing with me, but I could see it through another means. I could actually see it through a kind of second sight. I could see an aura that came up, and it was a certain aura, a very special aura, that I just knew that he was lying, and it never failed me. And I was perceiving this when I was 6 years old, believe it or not. So anyway, okay, let me go on. So Miles says, Julie, in my opinion, it is indeed per Jung in Memories, Dreams, Reflections. Okay, I'm not clear what that point is, but Gray Yates says, isn't there a new book of letters being published? There's a lot of things being promised for future publication, Gray. One of those is the so-called protocols. Memories, Dreams, Reflections was Agnella Jaffe's editing of the things that Dr. Jung said late in his life as psychological memoir. He was making a memoir of the development of his psyche. And this was severely edited, as I understand it, by Agnella Jaffe, because the book Memories, Dreams, Reflections is about 350 pages long. But apparently the protocols, which is all her notes and things that went into the preparation of that book, is 800 pages long. And the keepers of the copyrightable value of the Jung estate understand that in 2031, the copyright will expire for the protocols, and so they want to get that out. And so I've been told that that's coming out later this year. There's also promised an entirely new edition of the collected works to have 26 volumes instead of 20 as we currently have them. James Hollis, who's a very famous Jungian analyst here in Washington, D.C., told me that there are 80,000 letters that have not been published. Now, I don't know whether that's an exaggeration or what. I know that the only way Dr. Jung communicated pretty much was by letter. He didn't have email and that sort of thing. And, I send a lot of emails. I probably send 10 to 20 emails a day. And so if you figure that out over a lifetime, that's a lot of emails. And so it does seem to me that it's possible that there are that many unpublished letters. And then the other thing that is promised somewhere along the line here is the so-called black books, which are, I think there's 7 or 8 of these books, which were the actual notebooks that Dr. Jung kept during his Red Book period. So they are the raw experience as he was receiving it for 5 years. And what the Red Book is him later going back through his notebooks and putting those experiences in a very refined way, something like a medieval monk. And so if you look at a picture of the Red Book, or you can see it back over my shoulder lying sideways on the shelf. It's quite a large book, and it's all in German calligraphy, which Dr. Jung put in there himself over a period of 16 years. And so it's a very refined version of what's in the actual clinical experiences that he was having at that time. And so there are many things in the works. I think that Dr. Jung's name and so on does bring a lot of people to buy books, and I know that the Red Book has been very successful, and it's still in print. You can get it from Amazon. It used to be about $250. I think it's now about $150, and so it's quite an impressive thing. But there are many, many different things that will be coming out about Dr. Jung's work over the next 5 to 10 years. And it's, there are plenty of people around. I'm certainly not the only one who have devoted their lives to the work of C.G. Jung. And Sono Shamdasani is one of them. He spent 13 years preparing the Red Book. Louis Lafontaine, who occasionally shows up on these chats, is one who has now created a new YouTube channel called Carl Jung Depth Psychology, in which he's publishing memes of Jungian quotes. And he's been doing that sort of thing for many, many years now, about 20 years that I know of. And so there are a lot of us that have been called to this work. I'm currently realizing that I'm being called to it to proceed with the religious matters, and some of you know why I'm doing that. I'm not going to get into it right now, but anyway, there's a lot to think about and look at. Let's see. Julie says, I thought the difference between Western and Eastern thought is the level of self-awareness. Are not many Eastern cultures still deeply connected with tribal myth as opposed to Western ego consciousness? Well, tribal myth is certainly around on both sides. I think that because I've studied Tibetan Buddhism for about 20 years, not as a true practicing Buddhist, but my wife is a lay teacher of Tibetan Buddhism, so I have a lot of it in my life. And if I understand correctly, Drs. Jung and Edinger were saying that Christ represents the ego in the context of the structure of the self, or of the, in the context of the structure of the psyche, whereas the Buddha represents the self. And which approach is better from a religious point of view, I can't say. I think probably a combination is useful, and I sort of do them in combination, and I do them in combination with studying Dr. Jung's work from a psychological point of view. But, I occasionally do go to church, as many of you know, because you've seen some of my religious experiences that came out of church, and I just told a numinous experience that I hadn't thought of in years, which was this kindergartner who was my peer, who I could tell he was lying because I could see an aura around him that told me he was lying. And I knew that at the time. I remember it clearly. And so that was obviously a very numinous experience for me. It didn't happen in church. But as I look back on it now, that's the kind of thing we're talking about. And so yes, Julie, I guess you would say that it's a difference in self-awareness. I just want to see if I have prepared here. I used to have Edinger's diagram of this, which I sometimes show, but unfortunately I think I deleted it because my backstage stuff gets so complicated. But basically it's ego, and from ego it comes shadow, and then beneath ego, but resting on the self, are the anima and the animus, the so-called syzygy, and at the bottom is the self. And so that's the structuring of the psyche according to Dr. Jung and Dr. Edinger. And you can read all about that in the first 4 chapters of Ion, which I have read into the YouTube channel, and they're highlighted on the homepage of the YouTube channel. So you can find both my reading of Ion itself. I'm only up to about paragraph 105 of 460 some paragraphs, and gradually I'm getting to those. But I'm in parallel reading Dr. Edinger's commentary on that. And so if you want to have sort of a snapshot of the psyche from a Jungian perspective, that would be the place to look. And then yes, the Eastern approach is around the self, and the Western approach is around the ego. And I sort of rail about Hinduism and especially Buddhism, because I think they make very passive people. And someone once said to me, if you're trying to feed 1 billion people on $1 a day, then you need people who are insiders, who are looking inwardly and not caring what's happening in the real world or in the physical world. In the physical world, they simply don't care. And so you go to India and you find all these buildings that were built by the British before the British Raj ended, and the Indians haven't maintained these buildings very well, and as a result they're literally almost rubble now in Mumbai and places like that. You find them everywhere in India, but it's just an internal attitude. People look inwardly for their happiness. And I see it at my local gas station, believe it or not, because we have a Shell station up here on my corner, and it was, I guess, about 5 years ago, taken over by an Indian family. And, yesterday I went to get air in the tires for my mother-in-law, and lo and behold, their air pump wasn't working, or at least the gauge for the tire pressure isn't working, and they just don't care. I mean, you can see signs of that gas station starting to crumble. And one other thing you see is we're supposed to get a discount because of our grocery store. If we shop at our grocery store a certain amount, we're supposed to get a discount from this particular Shell station. Well, they find ways to cheat on that. So they changed the electronics in such a way that, you're supposed to get 30 cents off, but they give you 10 cents off, or they tell you don't have any discount right now. And so, those are attitudes of not caring about the physical world. And so, these are fundamental moral issues, and these are issues that we all need to make godlike decisions about. And that's the point. But let's see. I have to look at my length of my video here. Okay, we've gotten up to 1 hour and a quarter, so I'm gonna continue streaming, but I'm gonna stop my recording for a moment, and then I'm gonna restart it. And probably doesn't matter, because I think YouTube is only going to give me 2 hours, and then things start to get troublesome here. So let me just see what else I can respond to. The Julian, connection with the tribal myth issue, we have that problem in the West now too, where certain people in politics are trying to drive us apart and to make us tribal again. And of course, the strength of the United States is that we sort of rose above tribalism, and that probably reached its apogee at the end of World War II, when everybody was working together because we had to defeat something that was palpably evil, namely Imperial Japan and Imperial Germany and Italy. And so those had to be put down, and so we really became, the United States really became one thing, and that was very powerful, and we're still reaping the benefits of that power, but it slowly erodes as we try to become more tribal, as some politicians try to make us more tribal. So that's happening all over the world. It's definitely happening in Western Europe as well. But certainly it's true that in India, India is a very tribal place. And if you take a 100 rupee note, you'll find that the amount of a bill on any bill in the Indian money system has 14 languages on it, literally 14 languages. And so so they try to support everyone in their local language, and these aren't just dialects, these are very different languages. But I was once told visiting Belgium that at one time there are 3,000 languages spoken in Belgium. I don't know. Probably not true, but who knows? Anyway, I'm not sure if I'm going to have time on this too. All right, so let me try to read this letter. Thank you for the compliments. Anyway, okay, so this is the first of the 14 letters that appears in Edward Edinger's The New God Image, and it is a letter to Bernhard Lang, June 1957, and there's a footnote. The footnote says, Lang asked, quote, "Do you regard yourself as a believing person? And is your statement, modern consciousness abhors belief, simply the legitimate descriptive statement of a scientist about the present state of consciousness? Or do you identify yourself personally with this attitude?" So that was the question that Mr. Lang sent to Dr. Jung. And so here's what Dr. Jung said. "Dear colleague, many thanks for your friendly letter, which shows that the Buber-Jung controversy is a serious matter for you. And so indeed it is. For here that threshold which separates two epochs plays the principal role. I mean by that threshold the theory of knowledge whose starting point is Kant. On that threshold minds go their separate ways, those that have understood Kant and the others that cannot follow him. I will not enter here into the critique of pure reason, but will try to make things clear to you from a different, more human standpoint. Let us take as an example the believing person who has Buber's attitude to belief. He lives in the same world as me and appears to be a human being like me. But when I express doubts about the absolute validity of his statements, He expostulates that he is the happy possessor of a receiver, quote unquote, of a receiver, quote unquote, an organ by means of which he can know or tune in to the transcendent. This information obliges me to reflect on myself and ask myself whether I also possess a like receiver which can make the transcendent, i.e., something that transcends consciousness and is by definition unknowable, knowable. But I find in myself nothing of the sort. I find I am incapable of knowing the infinite and eternal or paradoxical. It is beyond my powers. I may say that I know what is infinite and eternal. I may even assert that I have experienced it, but that one could actually know it is but that one could actually know is impossible because man is neither infinite nor an eternal being. He can know only the part, but not the whole, not the infinite and eternal. So when the believer assures me that I do not possess the organ he possesses, he makes me aware of my humanity, of my limitation, which he allegedly does not have. He is the superior one, who regretfully points out my deformity or mutilation. Therefore I speak of the beati possidentis, of belief, and this is what I reproach them with, that they exalt themselves above our human stature and our human limitation, and won't admit to pluming themselves on a possession which distinguishes them from the ordinary mortal. I start with the confession of not knowing and not being able to know. Believers start with the assertion of knowing and being able to know. There is now only one truth. And when we ask the believers what this truth is, they give us a number of very different answers, with regard to which the one sure thing is that each believer announces his own particular truth. Instead of saying, "To me personally it seems so," he says, "It is so," thus putting everybody else automatically in the wrong. Now, in my estimation, it would be more human, more decent, and altogether more appropriate if we carefully inquired beforehand what other people think, and if we expressed ourselves less categorically. It would be more becoming to do this than to believe subjective opinions and to damn the opinions of others as fallacies. If we do not do this, the inevitable consequence is that only my subjective opinion is valid. I alone possess the true receiver, and everyone else is deformed, who lacks such an important organ as belief is considered to be. Buber is unconscious of the fact that when he says God, he is expressing his subjective belief and imagining by God something other people could not sanction. What, for instance, would a Buddhist say about Buber's conception of God? My human limitation does not permit me to assert that I know God. Hence I cannot but regard all assertions about God as relative because subjectively conditioned, and this out of respect to my brothers, whose other conceptions and beliefs have as much to justify them as mine. If I am a psychologist, I shall try to take these differences seriously and to understand them. But under no circumstances shall I assume that if the other person doesn't share my opinion, it is due to a deformity or a lack of an organ. How could I have any communication at all with a person if I approached him with the absolutist claims of the believer? Though I am sure of my subjective experience, I must impose on myself every conceivable restriction in interpreting it. I must guard against identifying with my subjective experience. I consider all such identifications as serious psychological mistakes indicative of total lack of criticism. For that purpose am I endowed with a modicum of intelligence. For what purpose am I endowed with a modicum of intelligence if I do not apply it in these decisive matters? Instead of being delighted with the fact of my inner experience, I am then using it merely to exalt myself through my subjective belief above all those who do not accept my interpretation of the experience. The experience itself is not in question, only the absolutizing interpretation of it. If I have a vision of Christ, this is far from proving that it was Christ, as we know only too well from our psychiatric practice. I therefore treat all confessions of faith with extreme reserve. I am ready at any time to confess to the inner experience, but not to my metaphysical interpretation. Otherwise, I am implicitly laying claim to universal recognition. On the contrary, I must confess that I cannot interpret the inner experience in its metaphysical reality, since its essential core is of a transcendental nature and beyond my human grasp. Naturally, I am free to believe something about it, but that is my subjective prejudice, which I don't want to thrust on other people. Nor can I ever prove that it is universally valid. As a matter of fact, we have every reason to suppose that it is not. I am sorry to say that everything man asserts about God is twaddle. For no man can know God. Let me read that again. I am sorry to say that everything men assert about God is twaddle, for no man can know God. Knowing means seeing a thing in such a way that all can know it, and for me it means absolutely nothing if I profess a knowledge which I alone possess. Such people are found in the lunatic asylum. I therefore regard the proposition that belief is knowledge is absolutely misleading. What has happened to these people is that they have been overpowered by an inner experience. They then make an interpretation which is as subjective as possible and believe it instead of remaining true to the original experience. Take as example our national saint, Nicholas van der Vlue. He sees an overwhelmingly terrifying face, which he involuntarily interprets as God, and then twiddles it around until it turns into the image of the Trinity, which still hangs today in the church at Saxon. This image has nothing to do with the original experience, but represents the summum bonum and divine love, which are miles away from God's Yahwistic terrors or the wrath fire of Bohm. Actually, after this vision, Nicholas should have preached, God is terrible, but he believed his own interpretation instead of the immediate experience. This is a typical phenomenon of belief, and one sees from it how such confessions of faith come about. Because this so-called knowledge is illegitimate, inner uncertainty makes it fanatical, and generates missionary zeal, so that through the concurrence of the multitude, the subjective interpretation, precarious enough as it is, may not be shaken still further. but the certitude of inner experience generates greater certainty than the interpretation we have imposed upon it. Buber fails to see that when he says, "My experience is God," he is interpreting it in such a way as to force everyone into believing his opinion, because he himself is uncertain. For confronted with the great mystery, no mortal man can aver that he has given a reliable interpretation. Otherwise, it would no longer be a mystery. It is only too plain to see that such people have no mysteries any more, like those Oxfordites who think they can call up God on the telephone. When you ask me if I am a believer, I must answer no. I am loyal to my inner experience, and I have pistis in the Pauline sense. And I have pistis in the Pauline sense. Now, this would be a reference to that definition of pistis I gave in the chat. So, I am loyal to my inner experience and have pistis in the Pauline sense, but I do not presume to believe in my subjective interpretation, which would seem to me highly obnoxious when I consider my human brothers. I abhor the belief that I or anybody else could be in possession of an absolute truth. As I have said, I regard this unseemliness as a psychological mistake, a hidden inflation. If you have inner experiences, you are always in danger of identifying with them and imagining that you are specially favored, or a special species of man who possesses one organ more than any others. I know only too well how difficult it is for people to stand off from their own experience far enough to see the difference between the authentic experience and what they have made of it. For if they stood by it, they would reach very weighty conclusions which could severely shake their interpretation. Obviously, they want to avoid these consequences, and my critical psychology is therefore a thorn in their flesh. I can also confirm that I regard all declarations of faith, which Buber, for instance, has in mind, as an object of psychological research, since they are subjective human statements about actual experiences whose real nature cannot be fathomed by man in any case. These experiences contain a real mystery, but the statements made about them don't. Thus it remained a real mystery to Brother Klaus what that terrifying countenance of God actually meant. Incidentally, I would like to remark that the concept transcendent is relative. Transcendence is simply that which is unconscious to us, and it cannot be established whether this is permanently inaccessible or only at present. In the past, many things were transcendent that are now subject matter of science. This should make one cautious, especially when dealing with ultimate things man cannot know about. We cannot, after all, assert that belief enables us to attain godlike knowledge. We merely believe we can become godlike, but we must modestly accept the fact that we cannot thrust this belief on anybody else. We could never prove that this would not be an unbelievable presumption. I, for one, am convinced that it is. All that I have written you is Kantian epistemology expressed in everyday psychological language. I hope by this means to have gained your ear. In case my idea of interpretation should seem unintelligible to you, I would like to add a few words more. Interpretation by faith seeks to represent the experience content of a vision, for instance, as the visible manifestation of a transcendental being, and it invariably does so in terms of a traditional system, and then asserts that this representation is the absolute truth. Opposed to this is my view, which also interprets in a sense. It interprets by comparing all traditional assumptions and does not assert that transcendence itself has been perceived. It insists only on the reality of the fact that an experience has taken place and that this is exactly the form it took. I compare this experience with all other experiences of the kind and conclude that a process is going on in the unconscious, which expresses itself in various forms. I am aware that this process is actually going on, but I do not know what its nature is, whether it is psychic, whether it comes from an angel or from God himself. We must leave these questions open, and no belief will help us over the hurdle, for we do not know and can never know. With collegial regards, yours sincerely, C.G. Jung. So that's it. Any thoughts? Let's see. Thank goodness I've been recording that. It only took 21 minutes. So, Julie, if you're still here, you said to Miles, I have witnessed this in my own life, Miles, not that I always want to hear it. What are you talking about having witnessed in your own life? I'm just curious if you're still there, if you would tell us. I suppose you're talking about the Holy Spirit. Let's see. So Julie says, I've lived in many cultures. I noticed very young and the lack of care for the external. I'm on my fourth listening of a... Thank you. I'm glad someone is listening. It makes it worthwhile. It often made me sad that they had put most of their life force into the next world. Yeah, and, that's what I observe, that, Tibetans are horrendously poor. And so there has to be a middle ground. I mean, even the Buddha taught the middle way. And so I suppose it's a matter of ego to learn a profession or learn a job and use that job to earn money. That's an activity of the ego, but it's necessary for human life, I would think. And what I observe with a lot of Tibetans is, they're happy to just go along and get along. I mean, my dear friend, the local Tibetan Buddhist monk, Lama Purbutashi Rinpoche, he lives on the largesse of everyone else, and he gets along, he eats, he spends all of his time meditating or teaching, and to his great credit, and we need that. And he came into the United States on a religious visa, and we need his teaching and his perspective. I mean, the amazing thing to me was we were reading in my Buddhist meditation group a passage about sort of ultimate Buddha wisdom, and it sounded exactly like Carl Jung and the self. And I wanted to talk about that with my 5 psychologists. I have 5 women psychologists that I go to this meditation class with, and I wanted to just chat about that, and they didn't want any part of it. They just wanted to study the Buddhism, and that was it. It's very interesting. Agatha says, many have a personal experience with the transcendental, but have no explanation for it. As we humans do not like unknowns, we accept man's ready-made explanations. Paul warned against this very thing. Yes, I think that that's fair enough comment. And Julie says, I'm deeply connected to my roots in Scotland. I can trace my family back to the 14th century here as far as records go. So I can relate to the tribal connection. Well, I think that that's valuable in some ways and a little bit erroneous in others, because, for example, in my family, I can trace my roots back to 1588, to the birth of the man who became my first ancestor in North America. And his name was Wolfert Gerritsen von Kohenhofen, and he picked up his entire family. He was a farmer, that's all. He was nothing special. And he was right in the middle of the 80 Years' War, which was that lovely war in which every summer the Spanish came up from sunny Spain in the summertime to beat the Calvinists in the Low Countries back into the Catholic Church. And every fall, the Dutch would open the dikes, flood their country, and the Spanish would go back to sunny Spain for the winter. And that went on for 80 years. It was quite a confrontation. It ended with the Treaty of Westphalia in 1648. But about 2/3 of the way through that, my ancestor was fed up. He just wanted to be a farmer. So he picked up his 3 sons and his wife, and they got on a ship called the Sheep, believe it or not, and sailed for New Amsterdam in 1625. And so those 5 people became 5 of the first 150 European settlers of Manhattan Island. And there are 2 farms that were built later because he became a freeman. He went originally on an indenture as an indentured farmer, and his duty was to clear a farm. This was in his indenture. He had to clear a farm which today would have its borders on the south end as Wall Street, and on the north end as Division Street, on the East River. And that was Bowery number 6. And so he and his sons cleared that land as the condition of their indenture. And then in 1630, he went back to Netherlands and bought his freedom from his indenture, and he founded 2 farms which appear on the Vingboom map, which is a map created in 1639. It's the first map of Manhattan Island. You can buy it at the Library of Congress. And his 2 farms appear on that map. One of them is at what today is the foot of the Brooklyn Bridge on the Brooklyn side, and the other one is JFK Airport, believe it or not. They sold too early. But he was always trying to get away from civilization. So in addition to being involved in founding Manhattan and Brooklyn, he went up north and was instrumental in founding Albany and Rensselaer, and that's where the family originally settled, all in his lifetime. He came to the New World at age 40 and lived to be 76, and that's at a time when people were living on an average 40 years. But as prideful as I am about that ancestor and the fact that we can trace back to him, and I'm literally the 13th and last first son descendant of Wolfert Gerritsen von Goenhofen. I had no sons, so there's no first son after me, but my first daughter will become the Donald of the Conoverse because the name got changed from von Goenhofen to Conover. But as prideful as I am about that, it's still only 81, it's 1 over 81/20th of my DNA. So I had 8,119 other ancestors. If you figure it out going back, you have 2 sets of grandparents, that's 4, 8 sets of great-grandparents, that's 8, and you double it going back like that, then he's only I'm only 1/81/20th of him. So we have to keep our roots in perspective and understand. And in my case, I mean, I do have a strong Dutch contingent on my father's side, but my father's mother came from Swedish origin. My mother's mother came from Welsh origin, and my mother's father came from Pennsylvania Dutch, which is Pennsylvania Deutsch, Pennsylvania Dutch origin. He was Amish, and so and this is my mother's grandfather, and we used to have a picture of him in his Amish regalia, and so really, as an American, I'm really, part of the 57 kinds of European American, and can't rightfully trace my ancestry back to any specific place, although traditionally we point back to Wolfert. But we have to keep our modern world in perspective, and if we're divided, as in the United States, the problem is that our politicians are trying to divide us, and our strength is in our diversity and being able to live all together, as many of you do in Western Europe. The reality is, yes, we hear of horrible things happening every day because that's what sells news, blood at 11. But the reality is it mostly works. I mean, yes, there was a woman who seems to have had a Muslim name, and she went into YouTube headquarters yesterday and shot a bunch of people and killed herself. But, she's one of over 4 million Muslims living in the United States today. And so I don't think we can say that she represents Islam. But, there are some cable channels in the United States that would tell you she does. So anyway, we have to rise above that. And part of my discussion of Dr. Jung is about that, is rising above that. So anyway, we've had a fairly long session here. Are there any other last questions? What I am trying to do, originally when I was when I started doing these behind-the-scenes items, I was thinking I would just, turn it on and read and answer a few questions. But I see that in order to appreciate a letter like this letter that I read today, I need to give you some background and some idea of where I'm coming from. And that's why I played the piece of the Edinger interview and the piece of the interview with Jordan Peterson, because that helps you understand the perspective from which I'm reading these things. And I'm not trying to convince anybody of anything. I'm just trying to make you aware of what Dr. Jung is saying, because I think that, people, for their own good reasons, have hidden away what his thought was. And I think it's very important, if we're going to live in a world where human beings can get along with one another. I think it's very important that we try to understand what they were saying, and also what all the religions in the world were really saying. And that's why I think Dr. Edinger's work was so important, because he clarified it for a lot of us. And with Jung's work, it's scattered all over the place. And as I said, if you wanted to get to these religious letters, you would have had to read 18 volumes before you got to it. And you'd be a Jungian expert, but I'm not sure you would really perceive the significance. And that's kind of what I have done over the years. But last summer, when I was laid up because I was doing my knee replacement, I happened to have this book, and this is the book I've been dealing with today, The New God Image. And I said, wow, holy cow, this is really valuable to me. And so I'm trying to figure out a way to convey its significance to a broader group of people. This is the behind-the-scenes look at how I'm trying to go about doing that. In the next few days, I will edit this video very substantially so that I can make a case, if you will. And then I leave it up to each of you as a vessel of 21st century people to bring these various ideas into yourself and find a way to think about them and see if they don't have influence on your lives. That's what I'm hoping for. So anyway, I'm going to sign off, and I'll do this again, but the next video, the next session will be tomorrow at 1:30 when I'll do my next section of Answer to Job, starting with paragraph 609. And we did decide to discontinue our local reading group. And so what that means for listeners is that I will be conducting reading group online henceforward, and that will be done on Monday at 8 p.m., which has been our traditional time. My local participants have agreed that they can participate online also, and that makes it possible to get the experience out to many of you. So the next reading group formal session will be Monday. I'm going to have to think about what the topic will be. I'll try to put that into the notice for this live stream channel, and that will be Monday at 8 p.m. Eastern Daylight Time, and tomorrow will be a continuation of my course in the book Answer to Job specifically, which I'm trying to go through paragraph by paragraph. So thank you for joining me. I see I still have a number of people watching, so I appreciate your participation today. And I'm going to sign off.